Hi guys, in this video I am going to go through Chapter 9 on mobility, migration, and efficiency. Let's start out by talking about the different types of labor mobility. This illustration here helps us understand type of mobility. There's locational mobility, and then there's occupational mobility. And there's different combinations. So type 1 would be same location, same occupation. So an example of this might be a UPS driver in San Diego becomes a Federal Express driver in San Diego. Again, same location, San Diego, and same occupation, a driver. Type 2 is what we call occupational mobility. Type 2 is going to be the same location, but a different occupation. So this might be the UPS driver in San Diego becomes an accountant in San Diego. So different occupation, but same location. And then there's type 3, which is geographic mobility. Type 3 might be illustrated by a UPS driver in San Diego that becomes a UPS driver in Phoenix. And so different location, but same occupation. And then finally, type 4 is the occupational and geographic mobility. And that might be a UPS driver in San Diego becomes an accountant in Phoenix. So they're changing both their location and their occupation. A couple of important points here. When we say a location mobility, we mean that you would move. So it doesn't mean that you got transferred from one neighborhood to another. You know, it's possible a UPS driver works in North County and then goes to South Bay. That's not a different location in terms of mobility because you didn't have to move. But going from San Diego to Phoenix would be a geographic mobility because you're probably not going to commute that distance. So think of relocating in terms of moving. And then occupational mobility, that means changing your occupation, not necessarily across companies. It could be within the same company. Upward mobility, for example, could be an occupational change if you go from being a driver for UPS to being a manager for UPS. Or let's say you become an accountant for UPS. You work in their accounting department. Those are occupational changes, even though they're within the same company. Interesting stat, the peak age for labor migration is 23. And I think a lot of you probably recognize that that's around the time people graduate college and when they are most likely to move. When we say migration here, we're referring to location mobility. And that's really what we're focused on in this chapter, is the geographic mobility that people undertake. That geographic mobility, that migration, has to be evaluated just like any other investment. You know, when we were in the chapter on human capital, we said, well, is it worth putting forth costs in order to get a degree for all those future benefits? In finance, you might use a model to determine if a stock or a bond is worth investing in based on its future returns. So there is this investment model that we deploy anytime we're dealing with a present cost that's going to bring returns in the future. And migration is no different than that. So we're going to use the net present value computation. This may look a little bit different than what we did in Chapter 4, but it's actually quite similar. This part of the net present value computation is the incremental earnings. So you'll notice E2 minus E1, earnings from the new job, minus earnings from the existing job. So let's say you make 60,000 if you move to Phoenix, and you'd make 50,000 if you stay in San Diego. Well, 60 minus 50 is 10,000. That would be the incremental earnings. And you would get that for each year that you're in Phoenix. Let's say you're going to be there for 10 years. Well, N would be 10. And then you would, impose a particular interest rate, discount rate based on what we learned in the previous chapter. The interest rate is typically the return that you could get on a savings account or the interest rate that you would pay if you borrowed money to fund that migration. And then over here we have the costs, what you give up. So this is what you get, right? The present value of the incremental earnings, and this is what you give up. And it's broken down into essentially C and Z. C is the monetary costs. They can be direct or they can be indirect. Direct monetary costs would be what you have to pay for. They're sometimes called explicit costs. So you might have to pay a moving company to help you move. That's definitely a cost. Indirect are sometimes called implicit costs. It's where you're giving up money. And for example, maybe you have to take off work in order to put together all your belongings, maybe load up the truck, all of that kind of stuff. Well, that's not a direct cost. You're not paying someone to do that, but you're taking time and giving up money that you could be earning. So it's indirect, implicit. Regardless, we add those together and those encompass C. And we would discount these just the way we would benefits. For example, a cost that occurs a year from now is going to be less of a burden than a cost that occurs right away. A cost that occurs 2 years from now is going to be less of a burden than a cost that occurs 1 year from now. The further into the future the cost occurs, the less value it has in today's terms. Just like these incremental earnings, the earnings that occur, in the future have less value than earnings that occur right now. That's the nature of a net present value computation, is it's attaching a value in present terms to actual future costs and benefits. And then you've got Z here. The Z is just psychic costs. It's not even discounted. It's very subjective and very hard to quantify, but we know it's there in theory. And an example of a psychic cost might be, if you had to move to, let's say, Phoenix. Well, it's really hot in Phoenix, and for a lot of you, you wouldn't like that, especially coming from San Diego. So you'd say, well, that's a downside, that's a negative, and it's reflected here. Okay, doesn't necessarily have to be a dollar value unless we're doing the computation. We know it's there, however. Interesting stat, the rate of return on migration is 10 to 15%, which is analogous to what you might get long-term in a indexed fund for the stock market. So that's actually, I should say it's better than that. 8 to 12% would probably be the average for an index fund over the long run. So you're actually getting more return from migration than you would with typical investments. And I think that's also better than what we saw with education. So migration usually yields a nice present value. Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. There has to be some upside. All right, let's keep going. Some of the determinants of geographic migration. Age matters. Migration will decrease as you get older, primarily because you have fewer years to recoup the investment cost. This N here is lower. If you're 20 and you're going to move from San Diego to New York to get an extra $10,000 a year, extra $10,000 for the next, let's say, 40 years, that's going to give you a lot more return on that moving investment than if you're 64 and you're going to move there to do your last year in your career. Younger people are also more likely to have just completed a human capital investment, education, and job shop. That is, the actual difference between E2 and E1 tends to be larger for younger people than it might be for someone that's older. In other words, there might be a huge premium for somebody right out of college to move to New York versus somebody that's, 50 years old, established in their profession, moving to New York. Migration also decreases with age because of higher costs from migration. The older you get, the more firm-specific capital you get. That's a higher C. Greater monetary costs. You might be vested in seniority and pensions, and so that raises the C. You might give those up if you pick up and leave to move to another region. More personal items to move, although it seems like that's minor compared to these other items. Certainly, the older you get, the more you accumulate, and it would cost more to move. I know somebody that moved in the past 2 years, and they spent $20,000 to move from the East Coast to San Diego because they're in their 50s and they've got a lot of stuff. Established in the community, Z is higher. The longer you stay in a particular region, the more roots you have there, the more committed you are to the community. I mean, something as simple as knowing the geography of your city, being able to seamlessly move around, knowing where the best restaurants are. this establishment gives you continuity and gives you a certain comfort that you lose when you go to a new location. That has to be considered. Migration also decreases with the size of the family. There's families have more people. So with more people, Z is higher. You don't just have one person experiencing psychic costs, you have other people. The spouse, the kids, they all have to be considered. Dual earning couples are less likely to move. A dual earning couple, when there's a migration, one of those spouses usually loses their job and they give up. So that has to be considered an indirect monetary cost of the move and the time that they're going to be unemployed until they reintegrate, if they do, in the new region. And that brings up the concept of a trailing spouse. The trailing spouse is the spouse that may move but does not have the same opportunities as the leading spouse. You see this often in families where there's one high income earner and another lower income earner. Usually the high income earner kind of drives the entire family to the region that's most lucrative. But that means that the trailing spouse is always having to adapt to that new environment. And again, that's a Z, that's a cost to them, along with C, especially if they're giving up a job. Another thing that determines geographic migration is education. More education, more likely you are to migrate. And this has to do with higher returns. People that are educated are often competing for jobs in regional and national markets. So the difference between E2 and E1 for migration is usually larger. And jobs for college educated workers often expect it. It's very possible that you would get a job with a company that has satellite locations all over the US or all over the world if you have a college degree, and they would expect you to go where they need you to. Another thing that influences migration from educational attainment is the lower costs from migration. College educated workers tend to be more accustomed to moving. Most people that go to college often just expect that they're going to be moving, and many college students have already done that. They went to college away from home, so it's part of their kind of MO. Distance is another factor. Migration falls with moving distance. The further away the destination is, the more costs there are from a transportation standpoint, among other things. If you're going to move from here to Phoenix, that's a relatively simple kind of transition. You know, hire a moving company, get a truck, maybe even just make several trips and transport your own stuff. But if you're going to move from here to Beijing, then it's going to be a little more costly. Unemployment rates also influence geographic migration. Migration will increase with unemployment, in particular at the origin location. We've seen this in the past. During the Great Recession, with a lot of people leaving high unemployment regions like Detroit and Baltimore. Those cities got disproportionately hit, and the higher unemployment pushed people to migrate. Well, in our model, that's because they're giving up less. So C is actually lower. In some cases, Z could even be lower because you could be in an environment that is so economically destitute that you want to get away from it. You know, crime tends to go up in those kinds of environments. Public resources tend to diminish. So it may not be as desirable a place to live. So C and Z go down. And don't assume that because people are leaving a particular region that they're better off in terms of higher earnings than in their prior position. Sometimes they lost that prior position, so they just have a job in the new region. They aren't necessarily making more. Another thing to consider is assimilation. Migration generally falls with greater barriers to assimilation. In other words, people don't want to move if there's a lot of things they have to do to adapt. Skill transferability, licenses, degrees, etc. Language, culture, customs, laws. You know, moving within a country is one thing. Moving across countries creates additional challenges. And what this does is not only does it lower the returns, but it also raises the costs. And maybe even Z. You know, some people would find traveling to a foreign country very attractive, and Z might go up. Or I'm sorry, Z might go down, but psychic costs might actually drop. But other people might say, well, that's taken me a long ways away from home. I don't speak the language, I don't know the culture, and so Z might go up. All right, that's it for this video. I will post the second part of this soon. Thanks.